Assalamualaikum. My name is Aina Maria binti Muhammad Jamani and I am from the Bachelor in English for Intercultural Communication program at the Academy of Language Study. So today I will be presenting my research entitled Gender Differences in Pragmatic Failures in the movie The Blind Side 2009. So this research examines communication misunderstanding involving Michael O'Hare and Leigh Ann Torhey. It focuses on how their intended meanings may be interpreted differently because of language choices, politeness strategies, gender-related communication patterns, social background, and also emotional experience. So my presentation will be divided into 5 main chapters. So chapter 1 will introduce the background, problem statement, research objective, research questions, significance, scope and limitations of the study. So chapter 2 will discuss about the literature review and the 3 main theoretical framework used in the study. And chapter 3 will explain the research design, scene selection, data collection and also recording procedures. And chapter 4 will be presenting about the findings from the 8 selected scenes. And finally, the last chapter will provide the overall conclusion, implication and also recommendations for future research. So for the overview of the study examines pragmatic failure in this film, which is The Blind Side. And the pragmatic failure occurs when the meaning intended by a speaker is different from the meaning understood by a listener. So Thomas 1983 defined it as a mismatch between what a speaker intends to communicate and what a listener understands. So it means that communication may fail even when the speaker uses a grammatically correct sentence. So the problem may not be grammar itself, but instead the misunderstanding may involve indirect meaning, politeness, social expectation, cultural differences, emotion, or even the relationship between the speakers. Because we tend to learn that we have to communicate in a grammatically correct sentence to be understood right, but this is not the case when it comes to pragmatic failure. So the study will focus on Michael O'Hare and Leigh Ann Torhey because they come from a very different gender, racial, social, economic, and even their family backgrounds. So these differences create an appropriate context for examining pragmatic failure. So moving on to the background of the study. So it consists of 8 main elements, which the first one is communication. The second one is pragmatic competence, which refers to the ability to use and interpret language appropriately according to a particular social context. And the third element is pragmatic failure, which happens when intended and interpreted meanings do not correspond. And next is gendered communication. So the previous study also claims that male and female speakers may develop different tendency involving directness, politeness, emotional expression and conversational support. So gendered communication shows that how a different gender may communicate differently. And next is intercultural communication, which Michael and Leigh Ann differ in race, class, family experience, social power and cultural background. So we can see how different they will communicate. And next is the contribution of previous studies on pragmatics and also gender. The 7th element is the research gap, because film dialogues have received less attention than natural conversations or even classroom interactions. And the final element is the reason for selecting The Blind Side. So this film presents repeated interactions between the two characters whose relationship changes throughout the whole story. So this research will explain that communication is influenced by language choice, social expectations, relationship and also contextual factors. So moving on to the problem statement. So the main problem addressed in the study is that knowing grammar does not always guarantee successful communication. So a person may construct a sentence correctly, but the listener still may understand its purpose or emotional meaning. So the previous studies have examined cross-cultural pragmatic failure, language learners, classroom interaction and gender communication. However, there is still several gaps remain. And most previous study only focus on naturally occurred conversations, interviews or even classroom interaction. And Next is film dialogue. So film dialogues remain relatively underexplored as a source of pragmatic data. And some studies also discuss that male and female communication styles without specifically explaining how those differences contribute to pragmatic failure. Finally, there is limited comparative research involving pragmatic failures produced by one main male character and one main female character across a developing cinematic relationship. Therefore, the study identifies and compares the pragmatic failures produced by Michael and Leigh-Ann in 8 selected scenes. So, moving on to the research objective and the research questions. So, the study has 3 research objective and research questions. So, the first objective is to identify the types of pragmatic failures produced by the main male character in Blindside, which the corresponding research question asks what are the types of pragmatic failures produced by the main male character. And the second objective is to identify the types of pragmatic failure produced by the main female character, which follows by the second objective is to identify the types of pragmatic failures produced by the main female character. And it was followed by the second research question, which asks what are the types of pragmatic failures produced by the main female character. And the third objective is to compare the types of pragmatic failure produced by the main male character and the main female character, which followed by the third research question is how do the pragmatic failures produced by Michael and Leigh-Ann compare. So these objectives guide the selection, coding and interpretation of the 8 selected scenes. So this study contributes to pragmatic, social-linguistic, intercultural communication and film discourse. Theoretically, it applies 3 different frameworks to the same interaction. The first one is Thomas, which explains pragmatic failure. The second one is Brown and Levinson, which explain politeness. And the last one is Tannen, which explains gender-related conversational orientation. So, for researchers, the study highlights an underexplored area involving gendered pragmatic failure in cinematic dialogue, and for language teachers, the selected scenes can be used as classroom examples. So they can show that communication problem may still occur even when the language is grammatically correct. And for students and language learners, the study increases awareness of indirect meaning, politeness, emotion, and also the cultural expectations. And this study explains that learners can still understand how misunderstanding occur and how communication may be improved. So the scope and limitations of the study is that it focuses on interaction between just the 2 characters, which Michael, her, and Leigh-Ann Tohi, because they provide the most sustained cross-gender interactions in the film. And the 8 scenes that were selected purposely. So the scenes contains questions, warnings, offers, emotional disclosures, expressions of care, and statements of acceptance. The main unit of analysis is the utterance. So, but every utterance is interpreted within its immediate scenes, relationship context, and also the listener response. So the study also considers relevant non-verbal elements such as tone, silence, facial expression, and also the body language. There are several limitations of this study also, which the first one is only examine the film itself and just one film. So the findings cannot be generalized to all films or real life events. And next, this film dialogue is scripted and edited for narrative purpose. And last one is it is a qualitative analysis, depends partly on the researcher's interpretations. Therefore, there is still a certain level of subjectivity may still remain. And moving on to the literature review, Chapter 2 will review the theoretical and empirical literature supporting this research. So this chapter discusses pragmatic competence, pragmatic failure, politeness, interface, gendered communication, intercultural communication, previous study, and also the film dialogue. So misunderstanding do not happen in isolation, but instead communication problems are influenced by language choices, social expectations, interpersonal relationship, and contextual factors. So there are three main frameworks that can be used to provide a clear analytical focus, which are the Thomas Pragmatic Failure Theory, Brown and Levinson Politeness Theory, and Tanner's Gendered Communication Theory, which we will be using in this, which the researcher will be using in this study. So the first framework, which is Thomas Pragmatic Failure Theory from 1983. So Thomas' theory is used to identify the type of mismatch between speaker intention and listener interpretation. And the second framework is Brown and Levinson's Politeness Theory. This theory explains how speakers protect or threaten face through direct, indirect, and polite communication strategies. And the third framework is Tanner's Gendered Communication Theory, which it is used to interpret possible differences in how Michael and Leanne communicate connection, independence, information, and emotional support. So, moving on, Thomas will identify what type of failure occurs, and Brown and Levinson's theory will explain how face and politeness contribute to the failure, and Tanner will explore how gender-related conversation expectations may influence the interactions. So when these frameworks are applied together with intercultural factors such as race, class, power, trauma, and family background, it will come out a result on why this pragmatic failures happens. So moving on to the Thomas Pragmatic Failure Theory, the main analytical framework is Jenny Thomas Pragmatic Failure Theory. So Thomas explained that pragmatic failure occurs when the listener does not recognize the speaker's intended meaning. And in this theory, there is two main types of pragmatic failure, which is pragmalinguistic failures, which occurs when the listener's form or communication strategy does not successfully convey the intended meaning. And the second one is socio-pragmatic failure, is when the speaker make different judgment about social rule, politeness, authority, social distance, obligations, or even appropriate behavior of a certain culture. So Thomas' framework is used to classify the misunderstanding found in the scenes from the blind sides. So the second theory is Brown and Levinson's politeness theory. So this theory is centered on the concepts of face, which refers to a person's public self-image during interactions. So there are two main types of face, which the first one is positive face. It shows that there's a desire to be accepted, appreciated, approved, and included by others. And negative face is the desire to have independence, personal freedom, and freedom from pressure. The next theory is Brown and Levinson's theory. So Brown and Levinson's theory can be applied when Leanne asks, "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" She does not directly say that, "Come and stay at my place." Instead, she communicates her offer indirectly. This may be interpreted as an off-record strategy because Michael needs to infer the real intention behind the questions, which to offer him a place to stay. And moving on to the Tanner's Gendered Communication Theory. So Tanner's Gendered Communication Theory proposed that men and women may develop different conversational orientations to their social experiences. So one important distinction is between rapport talk and report talk. So rapport talk generally focuses on emotional connection, support, intimacy, and relationship building, while report talk generally focus on information, independence, status, and problem solving. So this theory helps to explain possible differences in Michael and Leigh-Ann's communication styles. Moving on, Leigh-Ann often communicates care through direct action, decision making, and problem solving, while Michael is more passive and communicates through short and cautious responses. So these three framework will combine to form the analysis. So the Thomas framework will be used to determine whether the interaction involves pragmatic linguistic or social pragmatic failure, while Brown and Levinson's framework identifies the pluginous strategy, face concern, or phrase threatening act involved, and Tanner's framework helps to interpret whether the communication reflects connection and support. Moving on to the previous study and research gap. So previous research showed that pragmatic failure is influenced by context, directness, politeness, and social expectations. So studies of cross-cultural communication found that misunderstanding may still occur even when the speakers apply different cultural assumptions to the same utterance. So some study of gender and refusal strategy also found that some differences between male and female participants. However, those differences were also affected by education, culture, and some other things. Research on dynamic pragmatic competence also shows that speakers should adjust their communication according to the listener's response. And moving on to the research methodology. So this research adopts a qualitative descriptive design with a comparative orientation. It is qualitative because it focuses on meaning, speaker's intention, and listener's interpretation. It is descriptive because it identifies and classifies the type of pragmatic failure found in the selected scenes. And it is interpretive because the researcher explains why each communication failure occurs. And it is comparative because Michael's communications patterns are compared with Leigh-Ann patterns. And the primary data source of this is the Blindside, which is a movie. So 8 scenes were selected using purposive sampling. The selected scenes needed to contain meaningful interactions, an identifiable communicative act, and evidence of a possible mismatch between intended and interpreted meaning. So it will explain that the focus on 8 scenes will determine whether there is a whether there is any failure in their communications. So data collection also was conducted systematically. So the researcher watched the whole film several times to understand the theory, characters, and relationship development. And the scenes involving Michael and Leigh-Ann were recorded in a general scene, and the inclusion character were applied, and 8 suitable scenes were selected. And moving on to the data analysis. So the analysis was conducted utterance by utterance. First, the researcher identified the communicative acts such as question, warning, and the likely intended meaning, the likely intended meaning was also identified. And the listener's response was examined to determine the interpreted meaning. And the evidence of mismatch was identified through dialogue, silence, discomfort, tension, facial expression, or unexpected response. So Thomas' theory was used to classify the pragmatic failure. And the first set that accept is Leigh-Ann question, which is, do you have a place to stay tonight? And the scenes occur when Leigh-Ann sees Michael walking alone. Her intended meaning is to offer help and accommodation. So the second accept is Michael's warning, do not speak ill about my mama. It intends to defend his mother and express loyalty. And the third accept is, I never had one a bad. So Michael appeared to provide a factual information, but the utterance reveals emotional vulnerability and a history of neglect. So these are some of the excerpts from the movie. So overall, the findings show that Michael generally communicates through short, cautious, and emotional restrained response, while Leanne generally communicates through dry, direct statements. In conclusions, the three theoretical framework provides complementary explanations. So Thomas identified the type of pragmatic failure, Brown and Levinson explained the politeness and face concerns involving the cis, and Tennant explained the possible gender-related conversational orientations. So together, they show that successful communication depends not only on the words spoken but also on social expectations, politeness, emotional recognitions, and intercultural understanding. So future researchers may study other films to include more characters, examine different cultural backgrounds, or compare cinematic dialogue with real-life interactions. So thank you for listening to my presentations. That is all from me.